The island of Mull lies just off the western coast of Scotland. So we've had to travel by air, sea, and in Professor Mick Aston's case, some sort of self-propelled wheelbarrow to visit a remote promontory at Ballisgate, a few miles from the main town of Tobermory. And all this effort is because of these earthworks, located by two amateur volunteers. They met on Mull, having moved from England with their families, and joined a local archaeology project, where they promptly stumbled across something really special. Look at this from the Glasgow Herald. Meet the amateur sleuths who stumbled upon one of Scotland's earliest communities. And there's Hilda and Bev and some obscure lump. And here's Hilda, Bev and Professor Mick Aston. See what it goes on to say? Can we expect Bev and Hilda's chapel to feature on Time Team in the future? It really does say that. But the answer is, realistically, it's probably not going to be excavated. It's wrong. The paper's wrong.
Yeah, we're pleased.
I'd like you to excavate this area in case there are graves or bones.
At first glance, this earthworks survey does seem to show a raised platform with a small east-west building, an evidence of some sort of exterior altar or shrine. For Mick, this is a classic layout for a 6th or 7th century chapel. But then again, it could just be a small stone-built shepherd's hut or barn. So, after a bit of heavy-duty pruning, Trench 2 goes in over this striking square feature which Mick thinks may be a graveyard. But as we've already found a prehistoric grinding stone here, it may not be that straightforward.
There's Derek. Derek, come and have a look at this.
And the first dating evidence for the possible 7th century chapel isn't looking too good either.
Yep, that's definitely pottery.
How old?
Well, now you're asking, you see.
An expert would be able to tell.
Phil, there's another bit there. Just come up.
A little bit. So what date's that then?
On the face of it, 14th, 15th century.
But within minutes, the next piece of dating evidence looks much better.
It looks like a little Jersey Royal covered in mud, but if you give it a good clean, you can see it's a quartz pebble.
Ah.
Now, why did you make a noise like a pirate?
Because you get quartz pebbles, white quartz pebbles, on chapel sites in the early medieval period in Ireland and Western Scotland. It's typical.
Unless, of course...
Not one, but two pieces of domestic pot.
Which would actually suggest we're digging a medieval house. Hang on.
Well,
Unless, of course...
I give you another quartz pebble.
Oh, what? But hang on, I've got another piece of pot.
Faye, what have you got in your bit of the trench?
I've got another pebble.
And
Yeah!
I've got another piece of pot.
4-3, 4-3, what a match! And so it goes on.
Another quartz pebble.
But back at Trench 1, Mick thinks there's mounting evidence that we're uncovering something significant.
I think I can see a straight line across there, and then where you are, Faye, it seems to turn and go along in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, you're entirely right. We've got a line going down here, another line along here, and then up there, we've almost got this platform coming in.
We see that you say platform, and I think that's exactly right. It's one of these squarish platforms that, again, you get on chapel sites called lochts, which are like outdoor altars or shrines, or sometimes there are burials in them, and they're often square like that, sometimes with a cross or something in the middle.
Yeah.
But again, it reinforces that idea that we could be dealing with a chapel. We've got a couple of features that should go with that.
It's almost the end of day 1, and it's now becoming clear that in spite of finding more medieval pot, we may be on the verge of revealing a fascinating piece of archaeology.
The exciting news is that we think we might be approaching a floor level. And what is really interesting is that you remember that right up there was where we had that medieval pottery.
Yeah.
So in other words, if we've got the floor there and then a build-up of soil and the medieval pottery on the top of that, that floor potentially has got to be so much earlier.
What sort of date could it be?
Well, I mean, it could be any time from, say, the 6th century, if it's to do with Columba or his monks, right the way through to 1200, something like that.
So how do we find out?
I think the only way on a site like this is to get some bone so we can get a radiocarbon date from it. That's the only way.
That 1958, this aerial photograph was taken. There's the chapel there. There were no trees up here, so you could see out to the bay. You could see the ridge. We're actually sitting on a promontory. The chapel might have been sitting high for people to see. A farmsteads might be clustered around it. We've got to know what it's part of to understand it.
It may seem a long shot, but they're beginning to think our possible chapel is at the centre of a much bigger enclosure.
I think we should come and look at this.
Okay.
And to investigate what's going on, Mick decides we need to put a trench across a structure Stuart's identified, plus at least one more over a roadway and entrance into this newly extended site. I just hope that once the chainsaws have cleared the area, we can find the manpower to dig them, because we're still having problems deciphering the complex archaeology in Trench 1.
Ellen, take a look at that.
Wow, that is truly amazing. You know, this is just about the last place I'd have expected to see this. And it's a medieval silver penny.
Right.
I mean, it's just extraordinary. You can see it's got this cross going from edge to edge. And inside each quarter, it's got 3 pellets. And so I think it's going to be from about 1280 onwards, so late 13th or 14th century. I don't think it's going to be much later than that.
This coin is just the latest and most spectacular example of medieval activity on this site. We've also had 14th century pottery by the trayful, suggesting this was a busy place 700 years ago. Stunning discovery.
What we've done is taken the aerial photograph when there were no trees here, so we've got rid of the trees, laid it over a 3-dimensional model of the landscape, and look what we've got. Can you see coming around? See this wall coming around here and avoiding the chapel coming down here? But what we've actually got a large enclosure which uses the very steep crags and the flat ground within it to define basically one large unit with the chapel sitting in the middle of it.
So what might the implication of that be, mate?
Well, I can think of a number of sites in Western Scotland that look exactly like that. And well, the other sites are all monasteries.
Oh, you're joking.
No, they're all early medieval monasteries, so this could be another one.
What do you mean early medieval? What kind of date do you think this monastery could be?
Something to do with Columba. He dies in 597, so you're talking about
6th or 7th century?
6th, 7th, 8th century monasteries, yeah.
We came here looking for a chapel. None of us thought we'd find an early monastery, did we? Discovering a lost monastery from the time of St Columba, the monk who brought Christianity into Britain via Scotland, could be the find of a lifetime. Over here, we've got what Hilda and Bev originally thought was maybe a shieling, a sheep pen, something like that, although Stuart thought that it might be a bit more complex than that. How are you doing, Rexha?
Well, if you came here this morning, it looked like a big jumble of stones, but we now have something a lot more substantial. We have these absolutely great big socking double skin walls coming through, which doesn't really go with a shieling.
So it's not a shieling or a sheep pen or whatever, because there's too much of it.
There's too much of it. It looks rather complex. It's just very strange because it kind of comes round through there, and then we have this other thing coming through just through here, which we think is a cell.
A cell? That sounds monastic, doesn't it? This twin-celled building may not be the final piece of the jigsaw, but it really does look like the sort of simple dwelling used by monks on early monastery sites across the Western Isles. And they all have one thing in common: the influence of the late 6th century monk, Columba. So with only a few hours left, the race is now on to find a date to link our site with the time of Columba. And we've got a couple of potential targets for burials that might give us that.
It's over here. If you bring the sound in, it sounds quite hollow.
Jackie thinks she's found a couple of hollow-sounding areas outside the chapel that could turn out to be graves. And Matt believes he's just coming onto the floor in front of the altar, a classic place for the chapel's founder to be buried.
There's a distinct line of clay along there. However, that wouldn't stand up, obviously, if it was just built like that.
Right.
And might even be worth just pushing it back a bit, I think.
Personally, I'm amazed that such a potentially crucial early Christian site has completely disappeared from the records. But maybe, just maybe, this site has been commemorated in folk history. It's just no one's noticed until now.
Some people have said that if this was indeed an ancient chapel, there should be a Gallic name for it, which has come down onto the later maps. Now, if you go around and you look for the closest possible place name, we're here, and look, there's this name here. You better read it, Alistair.
Collier Crech Cat, which is the wood of the cliff of the cat. So it may be a reference to a wild cat.
Cleaning here under the altar area.
Yeah.
You can see this cut there.
Yeah.
There's a void in there. Do you want to just jump in here, Tony?
That's all right.
Yeah, get in there. It's very difficult to see, but that's the void there. If you look down, right down in that hole, the one at this end of the cut.
Oh,
Grave, right.
what's that in there?
That white stuff in there.
Yeah.
I think that's bone. I mean, it's pretty degraded like the other stuff,
Yeah.
but
They're coming up thick and fast now, aren't they?
Yeah, but look
you know
where
who
that is. And it's under where the altar would be, isn't it?
That's the most important place. That's the founder. That's the chap whose kill it is.
Look where it is, right at the east end.
Oh, fantastic. What a find.
That is just stupendous.
Matt has just uncovered the grave of someone so important that they may well have been regarded as a local saint. And the news just gets better on this phenomenal site. This tiny amount of bone was enough to give a radiocarbon date of the early 7th century, within 1 or 2 generations of Columba. It would seem that we're amongst the remains of one of the earliest chapels in Britain. Hidden in plain sight amongst the hundreds of stones we've been examining for 3 days is a part of the original Celtic cross that would have stood proud outside the eastern end of this chapel. But the chapel didn't just stand here in splendid isolation. We now believe it was at the heart of a small 7th century monastic site which must have been founded by the monks based at St Columba's Iona Monastery.
Time Team is 100% independent and funded by our incredible fans. Want us to make more episodes? Joining Patreon gives you access to exclusive interviews, 3D models, masterclasses and more. And you get to have your say in the process as we develop new sites.
Groby Old Hall lies in Leicestershire, 3 miles from Leicester. And to my mind, it's an archaeological theme park. There's an 18th century farmhouse, graced with the ruins of a magnificent 15th century brick manor, while in the garden, medieval masonry rubs shoulders with a huge mound or motte, the remnants of a Norman castle.
That's a classic motte, and just that big mound of dirt. And then there's a big old bank out here, look, ain't there, look?
Oh, yeah.
See?
Yeah.
There's a lot here, and it's all the more tantalising to us as no one knows what these buildings originally looked like or when they were built. So, to launch our attack on this fantastic site, we're starting with what we think was the home of Groby's first residents, the Normans. Geophiz have started to survey the top of the motte to see if they can pick up any evidence of that original castle. But Phil's already ahead of the game, as he thinks he's found our first glimpse of it just down the slope.
There's a big stone there. But you know what they say, Phil? 1 stone's a stone, 2 stones a Norman castle.
Or in my neck of the woods, 2 stones is just a couple of stones. But this does look promising, and the perfect place to open our first trench to see if we do have part of the Norman castle and evidence of the Norman family that owned Groby for centuries. A family so powerful that an internationally best-selling novelist has devoted years of research to them.
Fundamentally, this is owned by the Grey family pretty well from the time that the first Grey arrives as a companion of William of Normandy in 1066, and they stay here pretty well to the 20th century.
The Grey family? So is that connected with Lady Jane Grey?
Oh, exactly.
1371, this one is dated, so that's about the same date as the medieval wall that's still standing in the field. So potentially we might be able to find some of these structures in the ground.
Well, you might just be right, Helen. And we're already finding walls in Matt's Trench, but it's too early yet to give any dates or say whether this is the hall. Over in Tracy's Trench, we've now been digging for over a day, and I would like to have some idea of what's going on. Have you got any idea at all what sort of building this might be?
Well, I think it's probably a chamber block and a two-storey.
Why do you say it's two-storey?
Well, it is high status, it's substantially built, but if you look at the window over there by the door, it's only a very small window.
And what's the implication of the tiny window?
Well, if you've got a single-storey building, high status, you'd expect to have a lot more light coming into it.
Oh, I see. That implies that there must be another floor above where all the lords and ladies came.
With the windows in, yeah, the big windows, yeah.
So perhaps we can identify at least part of the home which the Greys lived in the 14th century. A two-storey chamber block with a top floor where the lords and ladies would have slept. And it's likely to be the White Chamber mentioned in the dowry document with a cellar below, possibly the wine cellar. So nearly the end of day 2, and I think our quest to piece together the story of the Greys' homes is looking quite promising.
Oh, look at that. Blimey, it's quite big bits.
It's all 15th century and probably the first half.
And whether this is the hall or not, it does look as though it's the same date as Tracy's building, so we do have at least one massive building complex. And Phil's finally got to the bottom of his castle wall. Have you done?
Too right, Tony, and it's been really, really worth it. It's just been an exceptional trench. I don't really want to leave it. I mean, we've known for some while about how this wall was built. So we've got these horizontally bedded stones that make the face on this side and on that side with this massive rubble infill, and then periodically these levelling up courses just to stabilise the whole thing. But the crucial thing that I wanted to know was, what were the foundations like? What was it actually built on?
And what's the answer?
Absolutely solid bedrock.
We already know where the Greys slept. It would have been in this chamber block over here, and we know where they wined and dined the aristocrats in the Great Hall there. But the one thing that every medieval family was most concerned about was saving their souls. And they wouldn't have done that by praying in the parish church or in some dusty old grotto. They would have had their own chapel, which, like everything else, would have been pretty high status. Now, Helen, this is where we've put in the trench to identify the Great Hall, and down here is this other range or hall that Mick's been talking about with the buttresses, and we're somewhere around here, I think. So where do you think that this chapel might be?
Well, from the dower documents, we get some idea. The first one says that something is near the chapel as far as the chamber above the hall door. So it's got to be close-ish to the hall, and here's the hall, door's probably down here, so it's in this rough area. Then it goes on to say, the chapel of the manor near the close. Now, the close is this enclosed courtyard, so we know it's near there. Now, when we move on to the later one, that says a chapel called the Old Chapel with the cloister by the same towards the south. And if it's towards the south, it's got to be at the end of this passage, one would presume, so somewhere around here.
Which is round about where we are. What do you think of this, Mick?
I think it must be somewhere in this area. I mean, there's a piece of Norman masonry built into the wall here, look.
Where's that?
Next to that black bag, look.
Oh, well, this piece here with the cuts out of it.
It might relate to an earlier building somewhere in this area.
It's not in position, but round the back wall that you can't see from here, you have to go in the garden. We're stood here. On that wall there actually are some sandstone blocks that look to be in situ as if they're part of an original wall, which might fit with a chapel being this location.
OK, it might be that side of this wall, but it might be this side of the wall. So I think we've got to look both sides with the geophys, you know, to see if we've got the layout either side of that. Somewhere in this area, but either that side or this side.
So the team begin to geophys on this side of the wall and that side of the wall to see if we're anywhere close to being right about the location of the chapel. Because middle of day 3 and what we really need now is another challenge.
That looks awfully like the plinths that were over there, doesn't it? You've got a buttress coming out, and that's what this scar is here, the buttress sticking out. So that would, I think, clearly demonstrate that if the chapel that we're looking for here, or the building we're looking for here, is on the other side of the wall in the gravel garden at the back.
I mean, the radar we did on this side was inconclusive. I mean, we got lots of disturbances we knew, but I'm still convinced if there had been wall lines, we'd have seen them.
Yeah,
and we didn't. So, yeah, all the evidence is saying chapel has to be on the far side.
And if you compare the geophys results from both sides, I think they seal it. The chapel's on that side of the wall. And if it was anywhere near as impressive as the hall's turning out to be, it must have been rather spectacular. Pretty impressive bits of masonry.
They're fantastic, aren't they? This is all part of really good quality window tracery, glazed window. And on this one, you can even see where the mason's set out his marks.
I love this V bit on Mick's one.
Well, he's got the top of mullion in between two window openings.
So like that, it would
yeah.
be so it is.
Yeah. Got a little arch either side of a central upright.
What kind of date do you think these are?
I think these are probably early 14th century.
So how does that tie in with this trench?
That shows us, along with these massive walls, that there's a really big building phase of early 1300s around this rectangular courtyard here.
Yeah.
Is this one of the legendary buttresses?
Yes. And you can see the mason's marks on it as well on the side.
Great, isn't it, that we've got the autograph of one particular worker who was working on this fantastic site.
This is clearly a huge building campaign that produces, from what you're showing us, some sort of really posh aristocratic manor house, not necessarily fully fortified, but like a palace almost.
The Greys are doing really well.
Absolutely. But after that, it's demolished and they start to build, presumably, that big house over there. And we're just getting glimpses in each of the trenches of what went on before this lot was put up.
So this is the bailey of the Motte and Bailey Castle?
Yeah, where we've got timber slots and bits of pots and odd little trenches. And we're never going to get a complete plan out of it, but at least we can see a much less regular layout of the buildings in this bailey before they come in. And, I mean, this is a mega project.
When the Greys were at the apex of their power. Great result. We now not only know what Groby's buildings looked like, but we can actually chart their history right back to the Norman period. After 1066, Hugh Gromany was given the land and built himself a really substantial Motte and Bailey castle with a stone keep and living quarters in the enclosure surrounding it. And this was the Greys' home until the 14th century, when they decided to upgrade. Most of the buildings that we've excavated seem to have come into use around about the early 1300s. How is that reflected in the history?
Well, we don't have anyone that we can definitely identify as the builder, but we've got here a William Ferrers who summoned Parliament as Baron of Groby, and he dies in 1325. So this is about the sort of time that you can imagine them going, we've got the name, we've got the position, we're rising in society. What we want is a really nice, big, medieval, style house to kind of back that up, really.
What about when our houses were demolished in the late 1400s, early 1500s? What was going on then?
Well, this comes into the people that I'm really interested in, because Elizabeth Woodville has two boys by John Grey, and one of them is Thomas Grey, and as part of her rise in the royal family, he becomes a marquis. He's given a marquis and he marries an heiress with the title. Maybe he goes, well, I'll start building here again and make this the show house that I want it to be if I'm going to be now a great Tudor magnate, having been a great Plantagenet magnate. So he builds the great brick tower and I think starts work on here.
So he might have demolished all the stuff that we've been excavating then, and that's where we get our brick tower. So perhaps when the Greys' fortunes rose with William Ferrers in the 14th century, they began to build their stunning medieval home with two-storey accommodation, a magnificent great hall and buttressed ranges forming a quadrangle. A property fit for the remarkable Elizabeth Woodville, Queen of England. And later her son, the Marquis Thomas Grey, went one better, demolishing this stone palace and building an even more fashionable brick residence, our 15th century tower.
Time Team is 100% independent and funded by our incredible fans. Want us to make more episodes? Joining Patreon gives you access to exclusive interviews, 3D models, masterclasses and more. And you get to have your say in the process as we develop new sites.
If people really did believe that Jesus played here when he was a lad, that would have got people flocking here, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah, that would have driven a whole pilgrimage industry of people coming out here to see it, you know, and the support structure for it. It's just that sort of thing that people travel around to visit.
So you're really champing the bit now, aren't you?
Well, of course I am. I mean, the point is that time and tide are the two things that wait for no man. We've got to get off of this island by early afternoon.
And we've only got half our diggers because the others are, I don't know if you can see, just round the headland there, up on that hillside. What are they doing there, Mick?
There's another chapel over there, halfway up the hill, and they're said to be the same size. One's said to be a copy of the other one.
But the mainland chapel has been excavated already, hasn't it, Phil?
Well, that's right. I mean, partially dug, at least. I mean, in the 1930s, some local Cornish archaeologists went in there. They were slightly eccentric ideas. They were desperate that it should be pre-Norman, and they kind of labelled it Celtic.
What do we mean by Celtic, Mick?
It's a shorthand term in the West Country for something that's after the Romans, but before the Normans. But of course, we don't have Anglo-Saxons in this area, so it's a shorthand term for that Dark Age period.
And it is a period that you are specifically interested in.
Yes.
Lights up his little face, doesn't it? The point is, on that chapel over there were deposits there that were not actually dug, so we could actually get some dating evidence there. As far as we know, this chapel site here has never been dug, and we should get some dating here. If we could date either or both of them, that would be incredibly important.
Presumably these stones sticking through the soil here are a bit of a clue, aren't they?
You're an observant sort of a chap, innit?
The chapel we're looking for on the island was dedicated to St Michael, as was the one on the mainland. In fact, medieval pilgrims are known to have flocked to sites dedicated to St Michael all the way down the Cornish coast. Back on the island, we've already found some possible chapel walls.
Just sketched in roughly where that
Yeah,
L-shaped trench is going.
And Stuart's nose for earthworks has sniffed out what he thinks is a nave for the pilgrims and a chancel for the altar.
You see, Phil's getting a bit of a wall coming out through there, which rather suggests that that's probably the first block, with perhaps that added onto it.
Right.
Mick's theory about the island chapel is a bit like Croft Andrews' theory that the monks at Glastonbury added a chancel to a pre-existing nave in the mainland chapel. And Andrew thought the original mainland nave was Celtic. So Oliver Crichton's been looking for clues as to why he did.
Just looking closely at this plan here from the Croft Andrews excavations in the 30s.
Yes.
Look at these two post holes. I'm sure those are worth looking at. And they're right next to what are marked on the plan as a set of steps running up here, up the slope.
So, why don't we put a little trench to take in those post holes and let's see if there's another one.
And if you're really lucky, it'll be an early feature.
That would be a very nice thing to find.
It's safe to say we can expect some rather complicated archaeology relating to different phases of chapels on both our sites. So what do you think the timeline might be? The very early, what they call Celtic chapel would be wood and we just find post holes.
Yeah.
Then what?
If we're lucky, we find post holes, and then we get a stone building on top of that, which is pretty small and pretty featureless. And then somebody comes along and revamps that with some nice architectural pieces, perhaps doorways, chancel arch windows, in the 12th century. That would be my guess as to what we'd see on the site.
The structures themselves could be the best clue we have when it comes to dating, because chapels don't have the domestic rubbish that we usually rely on to date buildings. Hey, Phil, that trench is coming along, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like we've got the beginnings of a wall, Tony. I mean, we always knew that there were those big stones just immediately underneath the turf, but now we've got it stripped off. You can see there's a nice edge there, but we really need to be able to get down to confirm that that is a wall. We certainly can't date it, but we can begin to suggest that it is a chapel. Jackie was showing me some bone earlier on.
What you got, Jackie?
The bits that are really of interest are these pieces here.
Now, these are bits of human femur, and it's quite a large individual. You can see these ridges running down here. This is where the big thigh muscles attach, and they really are quite rugged. So this is quite a large individual with quite chunky thighs.
So we've got the mystery of a big-thighed person somewhere on this island at some time. And he might not be the only burial here, because human bones are said to have been revealed as the cliff faces have eroded. Glastonbury acquired this land sometime in the 12th century, and legal documents suggest that there was already a chapel on the island at this time. They also tell us who Glastonbury sent to set up their new pilgrim site.
We find that one of the witnesses of the charter was Elias, then prior of the same place, and his fellow monk John. And this is wonderful because we there have the staff of the little priory of Glastonbury Abbey at La Manor. Just 2 monks, because you have to have 2 monks as a quorum to form a monastery.
On the other side of the water, we found steps coming down the hillside into the chapel on the mainland, chunky stone walls, and a floor surface carved out of the rock face. It seems to be deliberately terraced into the hillside at exactly the same height as the island chapel. Isn't it weird looking back at our chapel from this chapel?
It is, and yet this is strangely familiar. I mean, when you look at the size of this chapel and you think about the earthworks over there, they are very, very similar.
On both sites, we're trying to find out whether the chancels were put in as part of the Glastonbury revamp. So where are you?
Well, our trench is actually running all the way across here.
So have you found the skeleton?
Unfortunately, we haven't found any skeletons, and we haven't even found it at the grave cuts either.
What about this wall?
Well, yes and no. Can you see this, what looks like a wall running here? There's almost like face stones coming through. Well, they're actually floating on top of this dirt.
We need to get to grips with this wall to find out whether there was a nave here before Glastonbury added a chancel. And Bridge and Oliver have now found some post holes that might prove Croft Andrews' theory that this nave was Celtic.
It would have been a hell of a job cutting through that rock, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I haven't excavated them yet, but having stuck my trowel down, they're at least this deep.
So do we think we've got our earlier chapel, our early timber chapel?
If you're very, very lucky. On the other hand, of course, they could be late. They could be post-dissolution for all we know.
Yeah.
It's a whacking great thing.
It is, yeah. I was just trying to think, what is there that sits in the west corner of a church? The Western Gallery is something that was suggested, but I only know of post-medieval
They're post-medieval in date, yeah.
What we desperately need is some dating evidence.
It's just really maddening that you haven't got any finds.
Well, keep digging.
Nowadays, Looe Harbour's the starting point for a trip to the island, but it seems too far away from the mainland complex to have been used by medieval monks and pilgrims. And now Stuart has identified a more direct route between the mainland and the island.
Even today, twice a year, people and families still can physically walk across that gap at very low tide. It's sort of a pilgrimage, but there is the ingredients here for a medieval harbour.
A harbour?
Literally here. Now, if you look out over there, you can see how jagged those rocks are. They would really sort of rip the bottom off any boat that tried to land, even at high tide. And it's the same over here. But in this gap in between, in this bay, you've got these nice, smooth rocks in here.
Where this big sandy patch is.
That's right. So you could bring a boat in here at high tide.
If this is the place where monks and pilgrims embarked, you might expect to find lodgings nearby. And only a short distance away is a wall which Croft Andrew called the Monk's House when he excavated the site in the 30s. So based on the geophys, we're putting a new trench in to find out if this was where our 2 monks lived, or even a place where pilgrims could have sought accommodation.
If you look at that wall there,
yes,
that's the kind of thing that we're looking for, and it's not pretty dissimilar to what we're finding down here, is it?
On our way to the island, the wind turns on us, and we're getting a taste of just how difficult this crossing could have been. It's 10:10. At last the tide's high enough for us to get back out to the island again, but hopefully Matt and the rest of the team have been digging for the last few hours. Tony to Matt, can you hear me? Tony to Matt. What have you been doing since we left?
Well, we obviously put in a couple of hours' work. No, we got down to the beach, we found a kayak, we went out kayaking, and I had a dip in the sea as well. It was absolutely beautiful.
I'm so pleased for you, mate. See you in a bit.
See ya.
Despite appearances, our island team has made a lot of progress since we left. Tracy's exposed more of the north wall of the chapel, and Matt's been trying to find the east wall.
We've got through the rubble.
Oh, wow!
Yeah.
Oh, God, that looks like floor.
Doesn't it?
In the West End, Ian's cleared a lot of rubble and found something a bit odd.
What on earth is that?
Well, it's a big lump of iron. Look, God knows how old it is.
And all that before hitting the beach.
Proper freezing.
Tough life.
We've got the wall now. It is bang on east-west.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing now is what is happening in here, because we've got all this. These stones are mortared in, so this is actually masonry.
Right.
Now, what I don't know, and I'm trying to resolve, is whether or not that wall comes along and turns. In other words, we're actually in the northeast corner of the chapel, or whether it's actually a big sort of swell-in to take a buttress or a big column that might support a chancel arch.
Like the big stones we've got over here, in fact.
Exactly. And now you see down there, Matt had another wall.
Yeah.
Now, I did wonder at one stage whether or not that might be the south wall of the chapel. But now we've actually cleaned it up and looked at it, you can actually see that it's on a slightly different alignment. It's southwest to northeast.
Right.
So I'm rather hopeful, if it worked out all right for me, we'd have a wall coming here, be the northeast corner of the chapel.
Yeah.
This is the chapel. That would be a separate building outside it.
If Phil's right, the island chapel could be much smaller than the mainland chapel. So the theory that they were mirror images is looking a bit shaky. But it's early days. Ian hasn't found the west end of the chapel yet, although he has found plenty of other things.
Well, I'm plunging down into this deep, dark hole, and it seems to be full of Victorian rubbish. But at this end, we've got this huge wall, this revetment, down on this side.
That doesn't look Victorian to me. I mean, that looks like a prehistoric burial chamber or barrow or something like that. The whole thing does look a bit like a sort of big barrow on the top here, doesn't it?
You've got look to have more down there.
Yeah, there is a lot down here. You can see it's ranging from here to about here.
Yeah, so that looks like it's in situ. It's not moved anywhere.
So where's the grave cut?
Well, I think that these two large stones here, which end about here, mark one side of it.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've been thinking of as a wall here is actually marking the foot end of it.
Which is interesting, given that we've got that over there.
Yeah, it does look like that might be a head marker then.
Yeah.
The next one along.
Next one over.
Croft Andrew found a skeleton here, didn't he?
He found two here, but they were much higher level. Can you see in the section here, you can actually see where he took out this grave. And then it also seems that he took one from on top of this small wall here.
This gets better and better. The small wall was Glastonbury's chancel, and this means that Bridges' burial could well be related to an earlier chapel. And now Oliver's convinced he's found it.
Well, the evidence, we've got these two whacking great post holes in front of us, but the killer piece of evidence is the fact that they align really nicely with the rock-cut feature stretching off into the distance there, and the fact that together they're on a different alignment to the walls that we can see, only by a couple of degrees, but I think it's significant.
We've removed the chancel wall to reveal the grave Bridge found this morning and discovered it's potentially the earliest thing we found on the mainland.
The edge of the grave appears to be running along here. And as you can see, it's in a completely different alignment to this wall. So it's obviously going to be much earlier than this, but how much earlier is difficult to tell.
But what is interesting is that, you see, I saw these slates here, now tracking them back to establish whether it is actually a floor. And it looks like in this section, starting to get masonry, perhaps with a wall. And that's more on the right alignment to be associated with the alignment of these burials.
But the other nice thing about that bit of flooring is it's at the same level that that reliquary box is.
It looks like we're heading further back into the time of the Cornish saints, because the latest theory is that our burial and reliquary are from an even earlier chapel than the one Oliver found, which Glastonbury probably revamped by adding a chancel. And if so, pilgrims could have been coming to pay their respects to relics in this box long before Glastonbury's time.
So I can't get over digging down in here is just how much they've used the natural geology to really make the chapel stand out. Look, you've got solid bedrock over there, and look, I'm down over a metre down here, no bedrock. I think the ground must plummet away. This wall is right on the edge of the natural.
So they'd been right on the top of the hill. They could have seen the whole coastline and be seen as well, I guess.
That's right. But of course, because they've sited it here, they've had to make massive foundations, and they even splay out here to take the main thrust of the chancel. It's fascinating. It's a hell of a piece of engineering, I tell you.
OK, let's go.
Even as we're loading onto the boat, another kist burial emerges from under the south wall. Cheers, mate.
Cheers, Tony.
Thanks for having us.
Cheers, you're welcome.
It's beginning to look like this enclosure could have been a burial ground for thousands of years, maybe even into prehistory. Over the last few days, we've discovered that the story of our two chapels began long before Glastonbury's monks arrived, when Looe Island could well have been one of the earliest outposts of Christianity. And a chapel on the top would have been a beacon of hope for traders from the Mediterranean crossing formidable seas. Sometime later, another chapel was built on the mainland, at the same height, looking to the island, with our reliquary box at the altar for pilgrims to visit. And eventually, in the 12th century, Glastonbury's monks rebuilt both the chapels as a sort of St. Michael theme park. Over the last 3 days, we've just scratched the surface of this magical island, which has been a very special place going way back long before Christianity.
Hello, my name's John Gator. Time Team is fan-funded by Patreon. This vital support helps us to make new episodes. Joining Patreon gives you access to exclusive interviews, 3D models and masterclasses, plus lots more.